In this section, we're going to explore standards and assessments for literacies. Standards are what the expected learning outcomes are at different levels of learning and across a variety of subject areas. And of course, in this case, we're going to look at literacy or literacies. Assessments measure student outcome against these standards. Here in this session, we will be contrasting the fundamental assumptions and processes of standards or achievements and assessments with intelligence assessments. Along the way, we will examine the difference between a number of approaches, for example, diagnostic versus formative and summative assessments, norm-referenced versus criterion-referenced or self-referenced assessments, and select response versus supply response assessments. Finally, we want to posit the value of bringing formative assessment, that is, providing direct feedback to learners, closer to summative assessment, that is, providing a retrospective view of what learners have achieved, particularly in the new media learning environments.
We're going to look at questions of literacy assessment. This is the last section of this series of videos, and it seems assessment always comes at the end. You do your work, then you have a test at the end of the semester. Well, actually, one of the themes we're going to have through these videos is that maybe that's not the way assessment should be. But anyhow, in the interests of being sort of old-fashioned, eventually, now at the end, we've come to assessment. In fact, what I'm going to do is look at not just assessment processes, but what it is that you're assessing. So in contemporary curriculum, what we do is we establish a framework which is called a set of standards. These are expectations of outcomes at a certain level of learning, right? So it's a description of the framework of outcomes. Now, in the old days, the way syllabuses work and curricula work, is the syllabus said, look, these are the content areas you've got to cover year by year, week by week, month by month, and then people wrote textbooks covering that content. The whole purpose of the idea behind a standard is to describe a set of skills and capacities and ways of knowing and ways of thinking at a somewhat higher level of abstraction. It's really not about content, but it's about certain kinds of capacities. And what we do with literacy standards is we describe for each grade level or learning level what it is that you're supposed to be able to do in reading or writing, or if we think a bit more broadly in terms of our multimodal knowledge representations, how well we can express ourselves in these communicative forms. Now, it's against these standards that assessment now occurs. And what I'm going to do is through these series of videos, I'm going to talk about different assessment perspectives. Now, firstly, there's a classic sort of time distinction between assessment that happens before learning, assessment that happens during learning, and assessment that happens after learning. And the words that are used to describe these is diagnostic assessment. So in order to place students appropriately at a learning level, we will do pre-test diagnostic assessment to work out what they know already. Okay, so that's before we start. And these days, most importantly, they're done in cases where there are issues of student abilities and disabilities. We want to place kids appropriately because they may have certain physical or intellectual disabilities of some sort or another. Or let's say somebody's come from another state and we still have tracked classrooms and we want to know which level they're going to go in. I mean, there are fewer tracked classrooms in the world these days, but nevertheless, these are the kinds of reasons why we want to do diagnostic assessment, to work out what kinds of learning experiences and what kinds of curriculum are appropriate to a learner given their learning level. Now, formative assessment is assessment that happens during the learning process. In other words, it's progress assessment, it's assessment which often might be designed to give specific feedback to learners that helps them in their learning. And then at the end of a chunk of learning, at the end of a week or a term or a year or whatever, we often have summative assessment, which is sort of a retrospective evaluation of what the students have learned. And in fact, of all these three types of assessment, or these three times of assessment, the one that dominates, by far over the others is summative assessment. And in fact, what people complain about and what people argue about is that we've become just completely obsessed and overwhelmed by the amount of summative assessment that's going on in order to judge school systems, in order to judge teachers, in order to, it's a very managerialist, judgmental type of system. And, one of the critiques of this system is to what extent do these summative assessments dominate the teaching in a way which is often not hugely helpful, because the summative assessments don't give you feedback which helps your learning. At the end of the semester, you get a certain grade or a certain rating, and what does it tell you? You'd better become a better person if you didn't do very well, or it congratulates you if you did very well, but it doesn't give you any specific information or advice which will, in a concrete way, assist your learning. It has this kind of bureaucratic managerialist function, and one of the worries in education is that we've become dominated in recent years by bureaucratic managerialism as reflected in tests.